Welcome to the Bird Podcast. I'm Shobha Narayan. Our guest today is Dr. Erica Nol of Ontario, Canada. She's here to talk to us about the challenges of the Arctic breeding shorebird. Dr. Nol is a professor at Trent University in Canada. Her research interests lie in the biology and conservation of shorebirds across many areas in Canada and beyond. In particular, she studies the impact of climate change on the habitats and life histories of the Arctic and subarctic breeding shorebirds. Welcome, Dr. Nol, and thank you for talking to us.
Thank you very, very much for having me.
If we could start with the basics, for somebody like me in the tropics, what are some of the Arctic and subarctic breeding shorebirds? What are the species that you are talking about?
Okay, there are quite a few species. In fact, where I work in Churchill, Manitoba is thought to be kind of the center of biodiversity for Arctic breeding or subarctic and Arctic breeding shorebirds because there's so many species that nest in that area. But to name a few, Hudsonian godwit, which is like the godwit that would probably come through the tropics at some point. There are many godwits that migrate through the tropics. And then the whimbrel, which is the curlew, and there are curlews in Asia. There are curlews in Europe. This is the North American subspecies of whimbrel, which is a curlew. And then there's stilt sandpipers and least sandpipers, semi-palmated sandpipers, semi-palmated plovers, golden plovers, and black-bellied plovers, which are called gray plovers in Europe. And so many species of shorebirds. And they're all characterized by long distance migration. So they migrate from the Arctic all the way to the tropics in most cases. Some actually winter in southern North America, like in the southern states, but many of them migrate all the way to the tropics.
I was going to ask if there was some morphology or something special about birds that can breed in the Arctic, but you just said that they move all the way down to the tropics. So is there some way we can distinguish them from other species?
Well, that's interesting because the shorebirds in the Arctic are so diverse. They encompass different breeding systems, different feeding habits. You can imagine that a curlew with a long curved bill feeds on something very different than a plover, a semi-palmated plover with a short sort of multi-purpose bill. So they encompass a variety of morphologies as well as breeding habits. So some are, for example, lek breeding, like the buff-breasted sandpiper actually has a lek. Others are typically monogamous. They have a pair bond during the season and that they break when they migrate, but then they reunite most of the time if they both come back to the breeding area. And then there are some where they're uniparental incubators. So for example, only the female will incubate, or some where only the male will incubate, like the phalaropes. And then there's some that are biparental incubators. So I would say that they encompass the entire spectrum of mating systems and morphology in the shorebirds. So it is hard to characterize them that way. And we have to think about them really as tropical birds that exploit these northern habitats because of abundant food. But they spend most of the time in the tropics. And so they have evolved this migratory habit, long distance migratory habit to exploit these rich habitats in the Arctic, where there's this explosion of food in the breeding season because the breeding season is so short. And so this is a wonderful habitat. And people say that, or people have hypothesized that they also go to that habitat to breed to reduce the parasite load because there are fewer parasites in the Arctic because again they can't withstand the cold, the long sub-freezing temperatures, but also to exploit relatively predator-free environments for their nesting. So there are a number of reasons that they hypothesize that this long distance migration has evolved, but essentially they are tropical birds.
I was going to say maybe they have a high tolerance for cold, but you're saying they're tropical birds so even the breeding season is not very cold, is it? Again, it's hard for me to visualize. When I
Yes, it
say
is.
Arctic, I think cold. So
Yes, absolutely. The beginning of the breeding season, for example, right now, I have some students who have arrived in Churchill, Manitoba, my main study site, and there's still snow on the ground. So yes, the average temperature in the first week of June when they arrive is about 1 degree Celsius. So it is still cold and it hovers around freezing for about the first week. And then it warms up substantially. And you would be surprised at how warm it can get. In the end of June, it can be 25 degrees. And typically, and you can get days when it's 30 degrees. And of course, the Arctic is warming, so these temperatures are getting warmer. But as to your question about adaptations for the Arctic, I do think, and I don't know if there are any data to support this, but they do have a thicker, when they molt into their breeding plumage, that they have a thicker thicker feathers so that they can withstand especially those first few days in June. And they also have higher metabolism to deal with the colder temperatures, especially the very high Arctic breeders like the red knot and the white rump sandpiper. So they have differences in their physiology compared to birds that will stay in the tropics the entire time. Many, many differences. Differences as well in terms of their physiology for migration. There is a famous paper about how they shrink certain organs for migration and increase other organs for migration. So there are many specific adaptations for the migratory period. And they also weigh a little bit more. When they get there, they weigh quite a bit more, which so they have extra body fat so that they can withstand those first cold days, both for feeding and for actually getting enough food to lay their eggs, the females. So yes, there are some specific adaptations. So they're not exactly tropical birds, but they've evolved for this migratory pattern and as well for the first very cold period in the Arctic.
So before we go into your research, for somebody who's never been to that part of the world, can you describe what the habitat is like where you were at?
Yes. It would really depend on your perspective, but when you get off the plane, so I live in an area that has lots and lots of trees. And so I'm used to trees. And so when you get off the plane, it probably appears relatively bleak to somebody who has grown up in a forested environment. To somebody who's grown up in a desert environment, maybe there'll be some familiarity, but there are low shrubs, there are trees. It's the edge of the boreal forest. And so these are conifer trees, spruce, mostly white spruce and black spruce. And then it transitions towards the water into a flat open area with very, very low vegetation. Even the trees are just a couple centimeters high. So the willows and the birches are only a couple centimeters high.
Oh.
So it is sort of an undulating landscape with in early spring, mostly browns. But then as the season progresses, there's a whole suite of beautiful wildflowers, including rhododendrons and all sorts of beautiful wildflowers that kind of carpet the landscape. And it's a landscape certainly that grows on you. And it goes on and on and on. And the little wetlands, the little swells where the water congregates is where the birds primarily like to nest. So there are these wetlands with graminoids, with grasses and sedges, and the birds will put their nests on little hummocks in the wetland.
This is the Arctic Ocean, which I've never seen.
This is yes. So Churchill's actually on the edge of Hudson Bay, but yes. So otherwise you're in the Arctic Ocean, the Beaufort Sea in the west, which is where just north of Alaska, where there are many, many shorebirds as well. But otherwise, yes, the Arctic Ocean.
And the breeding season begins in June and ends when do the birds leave?
So that's also a huge difference from tropical birds. So they start to breed in early June, and it really depends on the weather. So the weather has to be warm enough so that the insect activity picks up, so that the females can gain enough energy for egg laying. And so that takes a while. You have to have temperatures above 0 degrees for at least a week, and for the insect activity to be sufficient for the females to lay eggs. And so they lay the first week of June. This is in the Eastern Arctic. It's a little bit different in the Western Arctic, in Alaska, where they breed a little bit earlier because the temperatures are warmer. But in the Eastern Arctic, they wait for sufficient food, then they lay their eggs, and they have relatively short incubation periods between 20 and 24, 26 days. And then they have young that grow relatively rapidly. And by the end of July, it's all over and they're migrating south. So
With
it's 2 months.
2 months
Yes,
with the
2
young.
months.
They migrate south with the young.
Yes. Now the adults will leave before the young. The females leave before the males. And so typically in Arctic breeding and subarctic breeding shorebirds, the female leaves when the young are maybe 5 to 10 days old. And then the male takes care of the young until they fledge, which is about 21 days, depending on the species. And then the males and the males will leave. And then the young sometimes stay a little longer to put on reserves, feed on the Arctic shorelines, and get enough fat for the long migration.
Wow. And the fledglings or the young leave in flocks. So they're not just making this long trek to Jacksonville, Florida on their own.
Yes, that's right. That's
Okay.
exactly right.
Okay.
Yes, they leave in flocks. And if you look at the phenology, you can see big peaks in the migratory areas of adults and then the young following. And then there are a few species that do something completely different, like the dunlin actually stays in the Arctic, stays on the shores of James Bay and Hudson Bay. So kind of the subarctic, but areas with long, extensive mudflats, and they feed there and then they molt into their winter or their basic plumage. Yes, so there are only a few species that do that. Most of the rest of the species migrate and then molt. Right. So there's all sorts of variation in their life histories.
Why are the dunlins doing that? Why are they molting when they're going to the tropics? Why would they molt into the winter molt? That
is a really, really good question. So there are a couple of theories. One of them is that they are avoiding the main passage of peregrine falcons. So they stay north until the peregrine falcons have flown south, and then they fly south. That's one theory, but it doesn't explain why all the other species don't do that. And so, so we don't really know why dunlin do that.
Yeah. Can we talk about your research? And I know it encompasses many areas, so we can just go one by one.
Yes, sure. So I am working, over my career, I've had students working on various species of Arctic breeding shorebirds. So for example, there's an area north of Inuvik, which is on the Beaufort Sea, on the western part of the Arctic, the Canadian Arctic, where we've studied redneck phalaropes. And this is a species that is sex role reversed. So the males take care of the young, the females are brighter and they display for the males, and then they have multiple clutches, and the male, basically they lay a clutch of eggs and the male takes care of it, and then they lay another clutch of eggs and another male takes care of that. And so then they're off. And so the male is the one that's of interest in terms of the breeding areas, and they place their nests just on the edges of ponds because they are an aquatic species. And so we have done some work on deciding which factors affect where they put their nests, and they like areas that are where they avoid shrubs. And one of the things that's happening in the Arctic because of the warming temperatures is shrubs are encroaching. And there's lots of evidence for this, especially in the Western Arctic, where the winter temperatures are really, really warming very, very rapidly, as are the summer, but the winter especially. And so there's shrub encroachment into some of these wetlands. And so we found that, in fact, the birds are avoiding shrubby areas, which is not a good thing for them, because those shrubby areas are going to encroach on the wetlands. But we also found in the Western Arctic that because the ice is melting earlier, and the ice is melting up to 3 weeks earlier in the Arctic Ocean and Hudson Bay than it was in the 70s, that you're getting these swells of water into the wetlands that can potentially flood all the nests. And we did have an incident where all the nests were flooded from the waters coming from offshore winds, high tides over over wet Arctic wetlands. And this is very typical to what happens in tropical areas as well. You'll get in shoreline areas, you'll get flooding into wetlands, which will flood all the bird nests. So this is the first time that we'd seen this in the Arctic. And this was already 15 years ago that we documented this. And so it's kind of, it's an unfortunate finding. In Churchill, we have also found that whimbrel in particular are moving away from areas where there is much more tree growth. And so the trees, as I mentioned, are Churchill is an area that is an ecotone between a boreal forest and the tundra areas. And so again, the trees are moving towards the coast and invading some of the areas that the birds previously nested in, some of these wetland areas. So that's one thing we're doing. Another is we are looking at the phenology of food, because there's a hypothesis about warming because the Arctic is warming more rapidly, that when the birds arrive, they may have missed the peak in insect abundance. And so we've done a little bit of work on determining when that peak is and whether the peak is shifting over time because of the changing climate. And so far, for some species, we found that there's still plenty of food for the young. And for other species, it appears that the peak actually is earlier, and that the adults are missing that peak, and then the young actually have lower growth rates as a result of missing the peak in invertebrate abundance that comes out, which is the reason they've evolved to migrate to the Arctic, or the major reason. So that's some of the work we've been doing.
And I know you talked about conservation as well. So what are some of the concerns that you'd like to raise?
Yes. Well, all of the species that I study are showing some evidence of decline somewhere in their range. And we know that mostly because the Arctic is very remote. It's very hard to get an idea of the size of a population of birds in the Arctic. We basically do it by extrapolation from densities that we acquire somewhere else in one particular local area, but that's fraught with difficulty, right? It's hard to know exactly how many birds there are. So for most Arctic breeding birds, we actually measure the numbers on migration. And the numbers on migration do tell us that most species are actually declining, because they concentrate in these large wetland areas, mostly along the east coast of North America. And those numbers have been declining for most of the species that I study. So they're all of conservation concern. With a species that migrates between a wintering area or non-breeding area in the tropics, migrates through all of these vulnerable coastal areas that are shrinking because of high sea levels, and then goes to the Arctic, where they have different threats based on climate change. You can imagine it's very hard to disentangle where exactly the threats are.
Yeah.
And so we have looked on the breeding grounds for some species, and we find that reproductive success is still relatively high. And so at least for some species, they seem to be replacing themselves. For other species, they have pretty low reproductive success. So for the whimbrel. And so we're just trying to figure out whether that actually balances mortality. Are they producing enough to balance how many adults are actually lost? And so we're trying to figure that out with population models. And for some species like the whimbrel, it does seem like they just have too low reproductive success to balance mortality. And so we're trying to figure out what it is on the breeding grounds. There is certainly an increase in predators, and in certain years when there are low lemming production, then predators will focus on shorebird nests. And so that is obviously a factor that can influence breeding productivity.
What does low production mean?
So breeding production is like how many young are produced. Yes. And then lemmings. Oh, I said lemmings are small mammals.
Yes.
And so there's an idea in the Arctic that if you have, because lemmings undergo population cycles. And so when the population is high, then there's lots of food for predators like foxes and ravens and potentially gulls. And so then the shorebirds nests are spared, because the foxes and the ravens are concentrating on lemmings, and they can get lots of these small mammals. When the populations crash, then the foxes have to move around a lot more, and then they come across shorebird nests, which have generally small eggs, but incidentally, and they increase the predation pressure on those eggs, and they reduce the breeding productivity. So they're just fewer young produced. So that's the idea. And some people have suggested, especially in Europe, that the cycles have also been disrupted by climate change, the lemming cycles. So then you have this kind of intermediate level of predators that's always hammering any shorebirds that are nesting in the Arctic. So it's very complicated. And we've been trying to do some work there. There's another factor too, which is we have some geese. I think there are geese in Europe too that are also very abundant. There's some geese in North America that are very abundant, and they, even though they're hunted, their numbers are very, very high. And again, this is a complex relationship. They're high because of corn production in their wintering area. So juvenile survival is higher than it used to be. And so large numbers go to the Arctic to breed, and that can actually destroy some of these wetland habitats. So I have had a student studying that interaction between the geese and the shorebirds. And for sure, if the shorebirds are nesting near goose colonies, then the shorebirds do less well than if they're nesting further away, because there are more predators concentrated around the goose colonies who then take some of the shorebird eggs.
Wow.
So it's a complex relationship.
So if I get it right, so the lemmings cycle of lemmings production is not timed to the breeding of the shorebirds, so the predators are eating the shorebirds is what you're saying in a way?
Well, what happens is that in some years the lemmings have very high populations, and it's all through the shorebird breeding season, and so that's fine because then the predators concentrate on the lemmings. Yes. But in other years, the populations crash. There are very few lemmings for the predators. Then the predators have to concentrate on the shorebirds. Yeah. Yes, or they come by. We don't know yet whether they concentrate, but they spread out and they increase their search, and then they find shorebird eggs. I don't think it would be possible, for example, for fox to specialize on shorebirds because they're hard to find. They're in tall grasses. But if they came across one through their traveling, they would definitely eat it.
And you said all the populations are declining. Is it because lesser, in some species, you said reproductive success is happening. So maybe they're starving to death or they're not getting enough along the route. Is that why the population is declining?
Well, yeah, I was trying to say that it's really complex. For some species, it does seem like there are not enough young produced in the Arctic. And then, and so that would cause a decline. For other species, there is some evidence that there might be hunting pressure in the wintering grounds. And so that's going to reduce the adults in particular. And the adults are very important, obviously, because they have relatively long lives. They have to return to the Arctic to breed the following year. And for some species, it does seem like there's disturbance on the migratory grounds. Yeah. So human disturbance on the east coast of North America, it's high population density. And so concentrated around many of these mud flats. You have the same problem in Asia and Southeast Asia with the spoon-billed sandpiper, where there's lots of disturbance on them and changes, reclamation of mudflat areas. So it's changing the nature of the migratory stopover areas where they stop. And so if they can't get enough food there, either in their southbound migration to survive the winter or their northbound migration to get enough energy to actually go to the Arctic to breed, then that's also going to be a threat. And I have to say that for most species, we are not sure of the exact cause of the decline. It could be a combination of all of these factors. And it's something that most shorebird biologists are working on now. Where is it? What is the factor? And where is it that the birds are having the most trouble?
I read an article in the newspaper about your tagging in Monadnock region, where you began nanotagging stilt sandpipers, and how there are some vagrants that fly about 4,500 miles in sort of a zigzag across the United States and Canada. So are there any interesting incidents or anecdotes you can talk about tagging and tracking these birds, as you say, the long distance migrants?
Yes. Yeah, that has been incredibly interesting. Yeah, so some of that work with still sandpiper is very preliminary right now because you do have to filter the data because there can be false detection. So I'm not absolutely sure that I believe that they're going all the way east and then all the way west. We don't know. We don't know for sure. But we have discovered, for example, we have a tagging study in the west coast of Canada, off Vancouver, which is on the west coast. And we discovered that some of the species that we thought would go down the Pacific flyway, so all the way down the Pacific coast of North America, and then down into the west coast of South America, so Ecuador, where many shorebirds winter, in fact, are going to Vancouver and crossing North America and going to the east coast of North America. So we knew a few species did this, but we've discovered in more species than we thought, which is really interesting because it seems like a long way on a map, but it could be that there are favorable. So the predominant winds in North America are from the west, and so the northwest, and then they pass across the continent. So it could be that there are favorable winds that take those birds right across the continent and then down to Southeast US where they do winter. So that was a real surprise. Another surprise was with the whimbrel was that we found when we put geolocators on. So these are tags that record the day and the night, record the time of the day and the night, the change from day to night, and night to day. And so you can tell from that what the longitude is of the bird, and you can narrow it down based on geography and possibility where they actually are. And so with those data, we actually found that some whimbrel go straight east from Churchill, straight southeast to the edge of maritime Canada, and then they take a long distance flight across the ocean all the way down to the Caribbean. So we knew this for some other species. In fact, a warbler species did this, but we didn't realize that whimbrel also did this. So some of them do that, whereas some of them take what seemed to be a safer route down straight across land and then to the East Coast and then down south to South America. So we have discovered quite a bit from those tagging data.
If you were, I mean, having studied birds, what is the priority hierarchy for these birds? Like, I'm just thinking of the birds that go from Vancouver all the way to the East Coast. Is it that ease of flying is the priority? Is it I get more food in the East Coast, down the East Coast, so I'm going to go there anyway, even if it's harder for me? What are they thinking? Which is
that's such a great question. I wish we could get into their heads to know, but for sure, I think that it must be a combination, and it must, for some birds, they think it's like historical roots, you know, that have changed over time, but still are advantageous for the birds, and they must be advantageous or they would be selected against, right, by natural selection. So it must be that there are favorable winds, and that the cost of migration is outweighed by the benefit. I mean, that sounds like a pat answer, but it must be true. You know, if they continue this migratory pattern, then whatever the cost is, and it may not be that much. So for example, you've probably heard of the bar-tailed godwit that actually migrates all the way from Alaska all the way to New Zealand. Yes. And they continue to do this, but they do have very favorable winds at the beginning, and they wait for those favorable winds that really, really help. So wind assisted migration is very, very important for all these shorebirds. And so we haven't looked at that with the sanderling, which is the species that we found doing this, that was unexpected, crossing the whole of North American continent. But I suspect that there are favorable winds. And then once you get to southeastern US, that the food supply is really quite rich. And there are lots of places that are protected as well, so they can have relatively undisturbed feeding.
So last three questions. Why do some birds migrate over water, like a full length, and why do some birds choose land?
Yes, that's also an excellent question. And if I could get into their brains, I could tell you exactly. But we are seeing that birds that are departing their breeding grounds later. So the birds that, for example, the males, I mentioned earlier that the males stay and take care of the young, they end up having to leave later. So they leave their breeding grounds later, and they tend to have more direct flights. And so they will migrate across land right to the east coast of North America, where they then stage and then they move down to South America. Um, why some birds go over land, over the water, it must be because of favorable winds. But some of these birds are in the air for 3 days. And so it seems, we think they're in the air for 3 days based on the tracking data. So it seems crazy. It seems so energetically almost impossible, but they do it. And so it must be that they are very wind assisted when they do it. But when we found that difference in the strategies of migration, we weren't able to figure it out because we didn't have a big enough sample size to figure out whether it was associated with particular sex or whether it was some birds that were early or late or had successful young or not, or whether they were better conditioned birds with better body condition. Although one of our studies has shown that if you're better conditioned when you leave the breeding grounds, then you can fly farther. You're much less likely to make stops along the way. So it is better, it must be better conditioned birds that do these transoceanic flights.
From shorebirds, can we move to songbirds? I know that you did research on songbirds as well. Maybe you can tell us about it.
Sure. Yes, I was working on songbirds, and I have been working on songbirds mostly for very applied issues. And so, for example, some of my early work on songbirds with my graduate students, always, all this work is with graduate students, just to clarify, was in Algonquin Park, which is a large protected area in Ontario, where they do log trees and they have various forms of logging. And so we were looking at the various forms of logging and the impacts on the birds. And as you can imagine, if you uh, take out some of the large trees, even if you're leaving the forest fairly intact, the songbird community changes. It changes so that earlier successional species are more likely to come in. For the most part, we found when we did that work that the reproductive success was not so much affected by the logging, but the number of birds in the forest declined. So the number of species associated with more intact forests declined. So that's some of the work we've done. We've also, and so the species for this is not a songbird, but a yellow-bellied sapsucker. We've worked on ovenbirds. We've worked on black-throated blue warblers, just to give your listeners some opportunity to know. Rose-breasted grosbeak, a very beautiful songbird of North America. I've also had students working on grassland birds, grassland songbirds like the bobolink, which is a declining species, also a long-distance migrant. And we've been looking at the effects of certain farm practices on that species. And as many other people have found, we find that haying, because many of the fields where bobolink now live are active farm fields. So they either have cows as pasture or they have hay production for cows. So hay is basically grass that is cut and then stored over the winter to feed livestock. And so the bobolink do very well in the hay fields, but if you cut those hay fields before the young have survived, then they don't do well at all. But they certainly do. There's certainly many, many bobolink that nest in hay fields, and it's become an important surrogate habitat. They would have been associated with the tall grass prairie that was across North America, and now they basically nest in hay fields. So those farmers are really responsible for the grassland birds. They need to keep the hay fields. Unfortunately, there's this, again, like everything else, very complex. There's a relationship between when you harvest the hay and how much protein is in the hay. And so if you wait too long, you lose some of the protein. And so the farmers have to take a little bit of a hit if they're waiting until the birds breed. And so I think there's room for compensation by the government. If they want to keep these birds, they should compensate the farmers for delaying the hay. And then in small pastures where you have a high density of cows, and these are mostly beef cattle, so they're used for food, the birds do not do well at all. They get trampled or their nests get exposed to predators and they don't do well at all, which is very different than what people have found in the prairies, where you have many, huge fields for cattle, and the density of cattle is much lower. But in our part of the world, the density of cattle is quite high. And so they are not compatible, keeping birds and keeping cattle. So yeah, that's just a few examples of some of the songbird work we've done, but most of it has been driven by some conservation need.
Yeah. I always ask our guests, what are your favorite species? And I'm tending to think that you like long distance migrants, but I could be wrong.
That is true. I do. I mean, it's fascinating to look at long distance migrants. And yes, many people ask me what my favorite bird is. And I mean, I guess because I studied killdeer, which is a very common species of shorebird that breeds in the temperate zone in North America. So it's not an Arctic breeding species. And it was the first one that I studied. So it does hold a special place in my heart. It's some people would think it's really noisy, and because it is really noisy, it sings its song, killdeer, 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 kind of incessantly. But to me, when I see it come back in the spring, my heart always flutters a bit. I do really like it.
Thank you, Dr. Nol, for being with us and for your insights.
Yes, thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Bird Podcast is produced by Ullas Anand and Echo Edu. I'm Shobha Narayan. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching.